There's a large number of participants from Germany, so you'll be able to continue the discussion with our Bielefeld students even after this presentation. You have already had the overview, that was the part that Basse lectured. I will have a look at the situation in Germany after reunification, and I will show you that there are health differentials even in a rich country such as Germany, and that the chances for health are not equally distributed, not only between social groups, but also between groups living in different parts of the country. In this process, you will also find out that in order to study these issues, you need some epidemiological and statistical methods, some of them a bit more advanced, but that alone will not do the job. You also need refined models of health inequalities and how social inequalities lead to health inequalities. Many of the models that are in use today do not thoroughly or satisfactorily explain this association. So there's room for better models still. Finally, I'm going to talk about the position that German politicians take. I mean, it is their job to help people have equal chances in health, but I'm going to show you that many of the politicians in Germany have kind of given up on this issue, and that it is unfortunately no longer one of their priorities. You all know graphs such as this one. What is shown here on the y-axis is the infant mortality, that is deaths of infants aged 0 to 1 year per 1,000 live births. And here on the x-axis you have the years from 1870 to 2010. What you can see is a steep decline in infant mortality in Germany, or some of the regions which were later combined to make Germany, even before biomedical interventions became available. Now, the first antibiotics were on the market, or were available in some selected hospitals, one should say, in the mid-1930s. It was not really until 1950 that they became available. Immunization started somewhere here, but the time when all the children were immunized against the common childhood diseases was only in the early 1960s. What you can see is that social factors such as better nutrition, higher incomes, and some environmental factors such as better water supply actually led to a steep decline in infant mortality even before the biomedical interventions became available. So my point here is that social interventions are extremely important in this respect. Now, let us look at Germany and the particular situation in Germany after reunification, when much in the social situation changed. You all remember that in 1990, former East Germany and former West Germany were reunited. East Germany being the country with the socialist system, West Germany the one with the capitalist system. It was supposed to be a reunification at equal level, but what happened in fact was that the West kind of swallowed the East. Now, since 1990, the so-called Grundgesetz, the federal law, applies to Germany as a whole. And this federal law, the Grundgesetz, postulates the creation of equal living conditions for everybody in the country and everywhere in the country. This is what our former federal president Köhler said some years ago. We have a high turnover of federal presidents these days, so this is the one but last. In reality, what I'm going to show you is that there is a demographic transition together with an infrastructural and socio-economic uncoupling of regions. That means regions in Germany develop much differently from each other. There are some which are very much advantaged and advancing quickly. Others are left behind, uncoupled, as some people call this. This actually leads to a marked regional and socio-economic inequality, and it is very likely that this will have major effects on health. Our federal president Köhler in 2004 said the following. He no longer talked about the federal law, but at that time he said there were and are major differences in living conditions throughout this republic, between north and south, as well as between west and east. Those trying to level them will cement the subvention state, meaning will produce a condition in which financial subventions have to be moved from one part of the country to the other, and will lay upon the young generation an intolerable burden of debt. What is important is to create room for people's ideas and initiatives. And if I move back quickly, you can see that this is completely different from what our federal law has been saying and what our federal presidents should be saying, namely the creation of equal living conditions. So today, the major differences in conditions appear to be acceptable, and what is needed is room for people to improve the situation by themselves. This is apparently no longer the responsibility of the government. Basse has already introduced you to the various models of social inequalities and health, or ways to structure social inequalities and health. The most obvious one is the top versus bottom, high income versus low income, or high education versus low education. There's also horizontal inequality, for example, in terms of gender, marital status, or nationality. Migrants have health disadvantages, at least in Germany, compared to the majority population. I'm going to add an additional perspective, that is the regional perspective, using the example of East versus West, and I'm trying to elaborate here whether or not this has additional explanatory powers for social inequalities in health. And the hypothesis I'm following here is that the living conditions do show regional differentiation in Germany as a whole, and that this will have consequences on population health. What has happened in Germany since reunification, since the East was literally swallowed by the West? The economic situation in the former East German regions was desperate. This is one of the reasons why the reunification actually happened. The West was perceived to be economically very strong, but of course enormous resources had to be moved from the West to the East. And when you look at the statements of sociologists or journalists on this reunification, you find a broad statement or a broad variation of statements. For example, one journalist by the name of Müller said German unity was a super MCA. MCA meaning the maximum credible accident, GAU in German. So reunification, an economic disaster. One of the major weeklies in Germany called the situation a balance of horror in the East. Now this is one way to look at it. There are other people, for example the sociologist Geisler, who talked about an explosion of prosperity in the East after reunification as compared to before reunification. Or the German Development Bank said the situation in the new states that is former East Germany, a success story. And here is another statement of a sociologist. He said, there's a fast convergence of living conditions between the East and the West. So even when it comes to these basic questions, was this a success story or not, you can see that there are vastly different descriptions of the situation. Let us look at some hard data. This actually adds to the discussion that Basse has been leading. What I'm showing you here are two bits of information in one graph. This is about the gross domestic product in the East and in the West of Germany, starting in 1991, that is the year after reunification, up to 2005. You see here on the left y-axis the change relative to the previous year. The greenish color is East Germany. And you can indeed see that there was enormous economic growth in the East in the first years after reunification. In fact, the growth was much larger than in the West. You can see the black bars here. This shows the economic growth in the West, which was much smaller, or in some years even non-existent. Over time, this converged. You can see that in some years there was only little growth in both regions. In some other years, very little growth, but a bit more in the East than in the West. But what is important, of course, is the level from which the growth started. And this is what is shown on the right-hand y-axis. You can see that the the starting level in the East was only about half that of the West. In fact, this red line shows you the economic development in the East relative to the West. So the West is 100%. You can see that even after 15 years after the reunification, it was only 70% of the West. So it actually depends whether you look at this y-axis and the first years after reunification, or that y-axis and the subsequent years, whether you could call this a success story or a disaster. Now here is another bit of information which helps you to better understand the situation in economic terms. This is now the household income, and this is a so-called net household equivalence income. That means this already takes into consideration that some households are bigger and other households are smaller. This has all been taken into consideration here. West Germany are the green bars here. East Germany are the kind of bluish bars. What you see here as the fat line is the medium household income. What you see at the top and at the bottom are the top and the bottom incomes. You see that there is a slight increase in the medium income in the West over time. Initially, a steeper increase in the East. But what you can notice here is that the lowest incomes in the East have not gone up at all. The highest incomes in the West, however, have. In other words, although the country in general has been becoming richer, the difference between the poorest part of the population and the richest part of the population has been increasing. This is along the lines of what you discussed with Basse and with the example of Kerala that Professor Tankapan gave. Now, one of the most impressive indicators which sums up the health situation of a country or a region is the life expectancy. And the interesting observation here is that overall the life expectancy in Germany has been increasing, has continued to increase even after reunification. And interestingly, the gap between the East and the West, at least up to now, has been narrowing rather than increasing. So here, in spite of the socio-economic differentials, there is some positive development. Blue here are the men. The upper line is the life expectancy for the men in the West. The lower line, the men in the East. You have here the period from 1956 when East Germany was still the GDR and West Germany was separate. Reunification occurred in 1991 or 1990, sorry. You can see that at that time there was a vast difference in life expectancy among men. And since then, the difference in life expectancy has been decreasing. The situation was not quite as dramatic for women. Their life expectancy, as is the case in most countries, is higher. The difference between East and West now has almost disappeared. So the difference for women is only 0.2 years in life expectancy, and among men it's about 1.2 years. So here, in spite of economic developments, a convergence of life expectancy. The socio-demographic situation, however, paints a more bleak picture. There are a number of indicators that are available even at regional level or local level. Unfortunately, for health indicators, it's not as easy to find similar data. What I'm going to show you now are a few socioeconomic indicators for the various regions of Germany, not only looking at the East and the West, but at other regions as well. The indicators I'm going to use are unemployment and the proportion of people who are on social security benefits. I'm going to look at net migration, population growth, or a decrease in population. I'm looking at the female-male quota, so the number of females divided by the number of males, which should be roughly 1, but as you're going to see, this is not the case in all of the regions of Germany, and the total fertility rate, that is the average number of children per woman. I'm also discuss the effects of population growth or negative population growth on the infrastructure, such as water supply or sanitation. And I'll give you some examples on the consequences for health, focusing on one federal state, that's the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia, the largest federal state, and also the one where Bielefeld School of Public Health is situated. Now here in this map, do we have a pointer? You've got a map of Germany. Berlin, the capital, is, I think this will do. And if you take a very close look, you can see that within the West, there are also some regions such as Bremen here, a big city, which has a very high quota of unemployed people and people on social benefit. The same goes for some of the cities in the Ruhr Valley, which are situated here. So at first sight, east-west and north-south differences. At second sight, there are also hotspots, so to say, in the West. Now what you need to keep in mind when analyzing a map such as this one, and I'll show you one or two similar ones in a moment, is the issue of population density. In this area, where does this arrow move? I'm sorry, the arrow has disappeared. Well, in this area in the northwest, only very few people live in absolute terms. In these spots here in the west, like here and here, there are several million people. So the absolute number of people on unemployment and social benefits is considerably higher in these small spots in the west than in these huge dark areas in the east, because there the population density is so low. Let me look at my second indicator, and that is the east-west migration. Now, east-west migration has been an issue since after the Second World War, in fact, the construction of the wall between East Germany and West Germany was meant to stop this population flow, mainly of young and well-educated people from the east to the west. You can see here for the various years how many people moved from East Germany to West Germany. 1949, this was when the two states were founded, until 1961 when the wall was built. Those were 2.7 million. You can see that even after the war there was still some migration, not as much. And when the wall came down, 89 to 90, within that 1.5-year period, almost 800,000 people moved from East Germany to the West, and in the subsequent years an equal number. It's only now that this has kind of balanced out. Now this movement from the East to the West was not just random movement. These were the young and these were the well-educated, and after reunification these were mainly young and well-educated women. In other words, who remained behind? Those were the ones with little education, with no job, those who were elderly, those who were ill. So you had a social stratification between East and West. If you look at this in terms of population growth, the blue areas are the ones where there's a substantial population loss, and the red areas are the ones where there's a substantial population gain. So you can immediately see that there is a strong east-west gradient. The regions of former East Germany are losing population. These are all the blue areas here, except for the region around Berlin. This is where the wealthy people from Berlin move when they don't want to live in the city. At the same time, you see the winners. These are the economically strong regions in the south of Germany, this part here, and some regions in the northwest. Again, at first look, a clear east-west gradient. If you take a closer look, a similar picture emerges, as I have shown you in the previous slide, namely that even in West Germany there are regions which are losing population, where there's negative population growth. And one example, I'm sorry, this arrow, here it is. One example is the Ruhr Valley, the former industrial heartland of the country, right? Here you have a population loss which is as dramatic as it is in the east. But remember that here in this area only 1-point-something million people live, whereas here in the area of the Ruhr Valley it's about 6 million in the heart area and 17 million in the larger region. So here the effect of the population decline is much larger. Same here in Bremen, same in the Saarland, also a former industrial heartland. Now, if you look at the consequences in terms of the female-male quota, it's quite dramatic. This is the number of women per 100 men in the age group 18 to 29 years. And if you look at the colors, now what is normal, or what should be normal, is this about 98 to 102. So this is where you have a balance, roughly 1 woman per 1 man. If you look at East Germany, and especially the northeast, it's 82 and less. In fact, if you move to this region here, there are only 70 women per 100 men left. All the young women who are well educated, and maybe some of those who are not well educated, have moved out and left the men behind, most of them jobless, most of them without a perspective. So obviously there's going to be negative repercussions on the social situation and on the health situation here. You're asking where they move? Well, of course to Bielefeld, because we're offering a master and a bachelor in health sciences or public health, and the female-male quota in this course is about 80 women for each 20 men, or along this range. Also, the women moved to the economically successful regions in the south of Germany. Now, this depopulation of the East is further complicated by the fact that after reunification, the average number of births per woman declined so dramatically as it has never been observed before, unless there was a war. What you see here is the TFR, the total fertility rate, for women in East Germany, that's in blue, and in West Germany, that is in red. You can see an increase in the TFR in East Germany during the 1970s and 1980s. This was actually due to the fact that the social policies in East Germany at that time were much more friendly towards families and women than in the West. So women had no problem having a child even when they had a job or even when they were attending university, because there was a social network which actually helped them to deal with the situation, unlike in West Germany, where this was much more difficult for young families to actually cope with the situation. When it became clear that the East Germany was in trouble, the average number of women already declined, and you can see that after reunification in 1990, when it was completely unclear how the economic situation, how the political situation would develop, the average number of children per woman went down dramatically, actually below one child per woman, and it's only now that it is catching up again towards the low level of the West. And that means, of course, that the next generation will be even smaller because there are less women growing up who are going to have children. So the demographic effect of this development will actually be felt only now and in the coming years and decades. So this actually further complicates the situation in that population growth will remain low in the East because this cohort is much smaller. As I have mentioned, this is not an East-West phenomenon alone. And if you look at the Ruhr area, this part of North Rhine-Westphalia, which used to be the former industrial heartland, you can see population declines in this area which are just as dramatic as in the East. Now, these are population projections to the year 2020. And you can see that in the large cities, Essen, Mülheim, Duisburg, Oberhausen, Gelsenkirchen, Dortmund, and so on, the population decline can be minus 10%, minus 13%. So declines that are just as drastic as those seen in the East. There are a few areas, regions, which actually have population growth. These are the areas where some families move. But overall, the decline is dramatic. So here, what you see is no longer an East-West phenomenon, but a phenomenon of growing regions and declining regions. Somebody has called this a redistribution of a shrinking population. And this is actually happening in the East and in the West. So it is no longer an issue of East versus West, but of some regions versus some other regions. This does have dramatic effects on local communities, and local communities are of course the ones who have to keep the infrastructure intact and who have to supply services such as kindergartens and schools. There's going to be a major decline in regional income tax, which is actually the money which will later be spent for social services. So for the Ruhr area, the area I just showed you, this is going to be minus 4% over the next 10 years or 15 years, whereas for North Rhine-Westphalia, the federal state as a whole, this income tax is going to increase. And the losses in federal financial transfers because of the decline in the population for these cities in the rural area is about 125 million euros. So substantial amounts of money that are missing when it comes to supplying social services which are so important for health. The problem is that the cities cannot simply scale down the services they provide. They may be able to close a kindergarten, but that means that mothers have to take their children much larger distances in order for them to be taken care of. But you cannot simply cut down roads or water pipes or the sanitation system. It's not that one part of the city will be deserted, but it's going to look like a Swiss cheese. You have some areas which are still populated, some houses which are abandoned, but this doesn't help. You still need to provide water and sanitation to all the area. You cannot cut down on these services. This is a problem in the shrinking cities in the west. It is a particular problem in the east because after reunification, the new water and sanitation system was over-dimensioned. And that means you need to flush these sanitation pipes regularly because not enough people are using them. So you use drinking water to flush out the sanitation system because it's too big. So the shrinking of cities is not a contractive process. Cities simply becoming smaller. Instead, what we see are perforated cities, and there's not much room for saving money on infrastructure. Of course, this also has consequences for health infrastructure, and here's the example of Brandenburg. This is the area in the east around Berlin. This area already had the second lowest coverage by general practitioners, 1,669 inhabitants per general practitioner, whereas in Germany the average is 1,548. And the number of GPs has been declining by 11% since 1996. And by now the proportion of GPs aged 60 years or older is almost 1/3. So that means these GPs are going to retire sooner or later, and it is very difficult to find successors in these rural areas. No young doctor wants to go there. Why? First of all, because all the nice things such as movie theaters and whatnot are simply absent from this area. And second of all, you cannot earn much money there because the population density is so low. You need to travel long distances to make home visits to your patients, which takes a long time and creates little income. So here we're actually experiencing under coverage of medical services, even in a well-off country such as Germany, where the total number of doctors is high enough, but they're concentrated in some areas. What are the consequences for health of these developments? I'm moving back to the rural area where we have some local data, and you can actually see that the average life expectancy of men in the rural area is 1.3 years below the average of the federal state. And for women it's 0.9 years lower than in North Rhine-Westphalia as a whole. If you compare this to the East-West differences, you can actually see that these local differences are much larger. Because East-West, the difference for men that was left was only 1.2 years, and for women only 0.2 years. I've shown you this convergence. If you look at the excess mortality, why is it that people are dying younger in the rural area? You can see that it's mainly the middle-aged group, 40 to 49 years, are affected, and most of the deaths are from avoidable causes, that is cardiovascular disease, which of course is related to a high smoking prevalence in this area, and alcohol-related deaths, which again sends a message that this is mainly a socio-economic problem, that particular socio-economic groups account for most of this differential in mortality here, or this excess mortality here. Now that you've seen that the differences in socioeconomic status in social services are not one of East versus West, but of well-off regions versus not so well-off regions, and that health differences or differentials have become visible already at the local level, the question is, are our explanatory models for health inequalities sufficient to explain this situation? Today's social epidemiology has been heavily criticized. Social epidemiologists have been criticized because they focus too much on data, so they're describing differences. That's what I've been doing all the time here, rather than explaining how these differences are produced. And one problem is a deficit of theory. I know you have had an exposure to theory this morning. Basse introduced you to some of the theories that are being discussed, but in social epidemiology they're not always applied. If you want to study whether regional factors have an effect on health and what kind of effect this is, you need a model which helps you to identify the underlying mechanism, and this model should also help you to decide what to do after you have identified these factors. Now this is the model of the association between social inequalities and health that we usually use in Germany. It's by Andreas Mielk. It starts with social inequalities here at the top. For example, vertical inequalities such as differences in education, occupational status and income. It moves via a meta level, differences in health exposures, differences in coping capacities which are unequally distributed, and differences in healthcare provision, via differences in health and illness behavior towards health inequalities that are differences in morbidity and mortality. And you can see that regional factors are not even part of this model. So this model is deficient in a very important respect. If you're about to explain inequalities in regional distribution of health, you need to keep two things in mind. One is that this could be due to aggregated variables at individual level, so biological, behavioral and status-related variables which can have an effect on the population structure, which you would call a compositional effect. And the second one, and this is the one which we will be interested in even more, are there factors acting at small area level, for example at the level of the region and the neighborhood. So these could be attributes of social and built environment beyond the individual level. So these could be contextual effects, aggregated measurements of exposure. For example, it might make a difference whether you live in an area where, on average in the area, the level of unemployment is low or the level of unemployment is high, irrespective of your own level of unemployment. That's what I mean by the regional or aggregated factors here. And that's an interesting issue to study because of the vast differences between regions in Germany in terms of socioeconomic status. So the question here is, does it make a difference for you, for your individual health, whether you live in a well-off area or in an area where, for example, unemployment is high? And that's what the previous model does not take into consideration. Some attempts have been made to study this, and this is where epidemiological and statistical methods come in. I won't go into much detail here, just give you a kind of flavor of how people are dealing with this. Strohmeyer, who is a researcher from Bochum, from the Ruhr area, actually created socio-regional clusters in order to be able to compare different regions in Germany and not run into any data protection problems. So he combines areas that are similar. These people around Strohmeyer have done an analysis of all the 54 counties in North Rhine-Westphalia and grouped them into 6 different types of clusters. This is North Rhine-Westphalia as a whole. You see that there are some prospering counties. These are the ones in light green. Some so-called family zones. These are the areas where well-off families move. But there are also some poverty poles. These are the former industrial cities in the Ruhr Valley, which I showed you before. By doing this, you actually have larger units of data which you can compare to each other and study the effects, for example, on poverty of a region on individual health. This is done using the so-called multi-level modeling. Multi-level modeling is a statistical procedure that has been used, for example, in education research. And the aim behind multi-level modeling is to find out what part of variance is explained at what level. It's pretty obvious when you look, for example, at schools, that the performance of an individual pupil is, of course, influenced by individual factors that operate on this pupil. Whether he or she comes from a well-off household or a not so well-off household, whether the parents help with the homework or not. But there are also other factors which play a role. For example, the class. In this class, are all the children well educated? Do they all have well-off parents? Or is this a class where there are major social problems? For example, a large proportion of migrants with language problems. So the progress of the class as a whole is much slower. But that's not the only level that has an influence. Also the school as such, of course, has an influence. Is this a school where lots of funds are available for laboratories, for excursions, or is this a school where these funds are unavailable? Now, a very similar approach can be taken when you analyze the association between socioeconomic status and health. This can be done at the individual level. Are you well educated, or are you working or jobless? This can be done at the household level. Household factors can play a role, but to a certain degree also the regional factors. The question, do you live in a region of high unemployment or low unemployment? Does this have an effect on your health? So this multi-level modeling actually helps to find out what part of differences can be explained at the level of the region. Multi-level modeling means analyzing data from different levels together, not only individual level as you may be used to, but also regional level. We measure health-related outcome at the individual level, but we assess the distribution of the total variance to the different levels of analysis, individual level, household level, regional level. We model the influence of individual and contextual variables as well as their possible interactions, taking into account the non-independence of observations within the regions. And if you have a statistician at hand, you can also complement this with spatial statistics, which is an even more refined method to look at differences at regional level. So this is what we're doing at the moment in one of our research projects. Let me come back to our former federal president and his idea of room for ideas and initiatives. If you remember, he no longer followed what was laid down in the German federal rule, that there should be equal chances for everybody. And he said we have to accept that there are differences between regions and that people should take it in their own hands. All that the government needs to provide are ideas, is room for ideas and initiatives. If you look at the vast differences, not only between East and West, if you look at the vast differences between regions in the country, such as the Ruhr area and better off areas, it's really very difficult to follow this postulation that all you need is room for ideas and initiatives. Because obviously, the socio-economic factors play a strong role in health, and obviously the differences between regions are huge and even increasing. So my hypothesis is that this alone is not enough. Equal economic living conditions in Germany are not likely to be achieved in the future. The health indicators for East and West Germany, they're converging, but the living conditions diverge in the whole of Germany at local area level, and apparently with negative consequences on health. It's no longer an East versus West problem, it's a rich regions versus poor regions problem. The exact mechanism is not yet clear. We're working on this one. There are no longer so much new insights by comparing the East versus the West. What is more important these days is the analysis of small regions, county level, rather than East versus West. We need refined methods to construct regional clusters and multi-level modeling. For the ones who are not keen on statistics, this unfortunately is an important part, but for those ones who are into social sciences or even the non-quantitative social sciences, of equal importance is that we improve the theoretical models. Because as you have seen, the theoretical model of the association between social inequalities and health inequalities that we use in Germany is not up to this issue anymore and needs to be refined. Thanks very much for your attention.